Today you're going to hear the story of Walter and Ethel Thompson Case, entitled, Did You Know That? Walter Case was a well-known reporter, and Ethel Case was one of the early supporters of the Long Beach Playhouse. Their souls have come back to tell their story, and they've chosen Lauren Morris and Dennis Kortheuer. Dennis left acting to earn a PhD and is currently a history teacher at Cal State Long Beach. And Lauren Morris is the current managing director of the Long Beach Playhouse and soon to be managing director of the Georgia Shakespeare Company. And now, did you know that?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome. As he mentioned, I'm Ethel Case, and this is my husband, Walter. We're here actually at the grave of my parents, Calvin and Ida Thompson. That's the grave right there. Like many here in Long Beach, we're from Iowa. I was born there in 1884. My father was a house painter, but his specialty was hanging wallpaper. He served in the Civil War, which is why he's buried in this section of the cemetery. At the age of 18, I became a teacher in a Utah mining town. Mr. Case, why don't you tell us where you were born?
Well, I didn't come from Iowa. I was born in Kansas in 1882. I graduated from Baker University, worked as a reporter for the Kansas City Star, which is still in publication today.
By 1905, we were married and living in Long Beach. Mr. Frank Roberts, managing editor of this city's Daily Telegram, recruited Mr. Case to come and work for the paper. Now that's quite an honor for a reporter to catch the eye of a managing editor. And as Frank grew older, Mr. Case took over as managing editor. And then in 1923, when Frank died, the owners of the rival Long Beach Press bought the paper. The Long Beach Sun, as you can see here, was the newest paper in town, and Mr. Case moved over there as editor. While Mr. Case worked for the newspaper, I cared for our children as they came along. The first was Nelson in 1910.
He was named for my father.
Then Roger, and finally Walter Jr. Mr. Case had always
Hoped for a daughter, but they were only boys.
As the boys grew older, I joined one of the clubs you might read about in the paper's society columns, the E-Bell Club. We studied the problems facing Long Beach as it grew from a small town into a big city. And in 1911, we worked to make sure the men could go to the polls and give women the right to vote. It was only fair we were doing just as much to build the city as the men were. Now, in those days, there was a need for all kinds of social services. So I joined the board of the Long Beach Day Nursery, which provided working women with childcare. Of course, there was also a need for arts and culture. Some of the E-Bell Club members focused on helping libraries, while others provided musical performances. My interest was in theater and the dramatic arts. So I joined what was to become Long Beach Community Players, now known as Long Beach Playhouse, though it still serves the community quite well, I might add. Mr. Case, what year did you start working on the city's history?
It was while I was editor of The Sun. Miss Jane Harnett, a teacher at Poly High, had begun already collecting information and had even started working on a manuscript. But alas, the poor dear died in the 1918 flu epidemic, and with her gone, interest in the project languished. Then in 1925, the Security First National Bank published part of it in an illustrated pamphlet.
That stirred local interest, as you might imagine, and it got city boosters involved. So, in 1927, Mr. Case and his associates came out with a handsome 2-volume history of the city.
Yes. Well, after that, I became known as the local city historian. All the old-timers flocked to me with their tales and their reminiscences of early Long Beach.
So, in 1931, he started a column called Did You Know That? Perhaps because it was the Depression, people were nostalgic for earlier times. So Mr. Case used the stories he'd been told to write that column.
Yes, and the Great Depression did more than make people long for better times. It also affected the newspaper financially. In 1932, the Press-Telegram bought the Sun, but it continued to operate it as an independent newspaper. I worked for both papers, writing for the Sun and serving on the editorial staff of the Press-Telegram.
March 10th, 1933 is a day I'll never forget. It was late in the afternoon. I was sewing a new spring dress for myself. It was green. Suddenly, the whole house began to shake and shudder. I dropped the dress and the needle I was holding and ran into the yard. It was a very large earthquake. Now, fortunately for us, our house was only slightly damaged. But what a mess it was inside. Everything had fallen off the shelves and the furniture was moved every which way. We didn't think it was safe to go back inside because the earth continued to shake. The aftershocks, those went on for quite a while. Mr. Case thought we should
camp outside until they were done. Mrs. Case prepared 3 meals a day, picnic style, not only for our family but also for our neighbors. Finally, when it started to rain, we moved back inside.
By that time, we had cleaned up the mess, and I'd found my needle. I finished that dress and had it ready to wear a week later at the meeting of the Los Angeles County Federation of Women's Clubs. Now, my friend Mrs. Edith Vandewater presided over that meeting, and she referred to me as an earthquake refugee. She also mentioned that I was serving as corresponding secretary for the Federation.
It's well known that of the two of us, I was the writer.
I did not like writing at all. But luckily, my real job as corresponding secretary was driving Mrs. Vandewater around, getting her a new lipstick when she needed one, and licking stamps for letters that others wrote. I became an expert at licking stamps. While not a writer, I was a very good event planner. I helped put on Neptune's electrical extravaganza at Marine Stadium in 1933 to raise money for earthquake relief. And in 1934, I was on the board that brought the Navy Ball to Municipal Auditorium.
And as the gloom of the Depression lifted, we decided it was time to put out another edition of the Long Beach City history. We financed it the same way as we had the previous one, by asking local prominent citizens to become sponsors. In return, they'd be included in the biographical section in the back. For those who were especially generous, we even included their photo. Books like these were being published all across the country.
Cynics called them mug books, but they're useful sources of information even today. In fact, Mr. Case and his associates published 3 more volumes of these histories. The first in 1935, another in 1942, and what was the year you published the last one?
1948. It was the year after I retired from the newspaper. You can still read these books, by the way, in the Historical Society of Long Beach. They have a complete set.
While Mr. Case worked on the histories, I stayed very active in the community. I was head of the city's Red Cross during the war. And I took an even greater interest in the community players. We found a good location on Anaheim Street across a recreation park and worked to raise money to build a theater there. Times were tough during the Depression and the war, but we managed to raise a building fund. Finally, in 1951, with a mortgage from Farmers and Merchants Bank, we got our own theater there. I served as president of the Long Beach Playhouse Board from 1931 to 1957. And because I managed the day-to-day operations, they gave me the title of Administrative Business Manager.
I died just a few years after Mrs. Case left the board of the Playhouse. It was 1960. I had lived a full life and had lived it doing the things I loved.
And his legacy lives on in his newspaper career and in the history books he wrote.
And I understand the Historical Society has recently acquired bound copies of many of the city's newspapers. They already have them shelved in one of the galleries. They're just waiting for a little more support so they can preserve them and make them available for the public to be able to read them. When that happens, you'll be able to read my work there.
Of course, I missed my dear Mr. Case, but I stayed busy and I continued to work at the Playhouse until 1963. We knew we were doing a good job with the plays we put on because we sold a lot of tickets. The work we did there was a success for the whole community. My time at the Playhouse came to an end when some new board members thought that we should expand and build a smaller theater upstairs. Now, I worried that we wouldn't be able to sustain operations for 2 theaters. But in the end, I'm happy to say they were successful and my doubts were proven unfounded. As time went on, I knew the work I did at the Playhouse hadn't been forgotten. My picture still hangs in the lobby and backstage, and they named their awards after me. In fact, the city's Southland magazine wrote an article about me in 1966 called The Four Hats of Mrs. Case. In 1971, at the age of 86, I died, but I live on in the contributions I made to the community, and especially to the Playhouse. So do me a favor, buy a ticket, see a play, and support the theater I loved. Love. Mr. Case, do you have any final words?
Well, just to say thank you very much for supporting the Historical Society, and especially thank you for listening to our story.
Thank you.
Thank you.